your providence, you chose your servant Patrick to be the apostle to the Irish people, to bring those who were wandering in darkness and error to the true light and knowledge of you. Grant us so to walk in that way, that we may come at last to the light of everlasting life. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever.
Amen.
Amen. Well, again, good morning. That was the prayer that we offer on the feast day of St. Patrick, also known as St. Patrick's Day, which is March the 17th. Today I'm going to mention a little bit about Patrick, and then we're going to talk more about Patrick and a few of the other Celtic saints as we move forward. I did this because not all Celtic saints are from Ireland, obviously, but Patrick has a very important role in the early part of what will become a defining piece of what we think of as the Celtic Church or Celtic Christianity. Today, this morning, we're going to talk about the Celtic Church history and inspiration, and really get into the historics of what we actually know about Celtic Christianity. Last week, I asked you what makes you think about Celtic Christianity. What is it that draws you to Celtic Christianity? And we had a whole lot of really good comments about that. We talked about the environment which the Celts lived in and their understanding of God within that environment. We talked about the idea of Celtic monastic life. We talked about the view of the native peoples of the Celtic world and relationships with women. And somebody asked a question about Druids. All of these things are things we think about when we think about Celtic Christianity. But not that those things aren't important, and that they'll have an important role in our understanding of Celtic Christianity today. But as always, there's those pesky scholars and historians who come in and turn over what you think you know about everything, right? And that's part of the case with Celtic Christianity, because again, for those of us who come from these parts of Western Europe that are considered to be Celtic countries or were Celtic countries, there's a romanticizing about what Celtic Christianity must have been like. And as you know, when we romanticize something, we sometimes go a little too far in our understandings of what really happened and what we wished happened. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today, because it's the case in all of history, especially when you get back into that ancient times. I mean, you can think about this in relation to the history of Native Americans, our understanding of Native American culture and what happened within the history of Native American communities. All of this, when we get into that blurry, foggy area of where history and legend and if we got to go all the way back in time to get to that place, and within that place, we learn a lot more about ourselves sometimes than we learn about real history. And that's the case with our culture and the idea of Celtic spirituality and the Celtic Christianity and the Celtic Church. Within all of it are some pieces of what really did happen, the truth, but then we take it to a whole nother level and turn it into a 19th, 20th, and 21st century thought process. So today we're just going to talk about what we do know about Celtic Christianity, and honestly we know a lot more about Celtic Christianity than we know about the Druids. Remember when somebody asked a question about the pagan traditions of Ireland and Britain and Wales and Scotland and our association with that pagan faith and the idea of Druids, right? But as I told you last week, and I think I'm correct on this, I've got to go back and do more of my research, and I don't spend as much time with the Druids these days. What we know mostly about Druids came to us from the Romans, who came into Britain in order to take over the most western part of the European world, and discovered these native peoples that they saw most likely the way English and other colonists in America viewed the Native Americans, a very native group of people with a native faith tradition. And so what they write about the Druids we have to sort through because they didn't like the Druids very much. And what they tell us about the Druids, we have to pick through and sort out. It's not as much about the Celtic Church. We do know a good bit about it in its history because of what they left behind, and because rather than talking about something that dates back from before the time of Jesus, we're dealing with something that happens in the last 2,000 years. And that's a long time ago, but we still have more information on it. So today we're going to look a little bit at that. So the first question is, what do we really know about Celtic Christianity in the church in Celtic countries? And I thought I'd kick this off with one of the great ways of interpreting Celtic Christianity that's left to us today. And we find most of these in Ireland, and that is these amazing Celtic crosses. Now I say these amazing, really you could probably count how many that still exist on one or two hands, but there are certain places in Ireland that still have some that date back to into the Middle Ages. Again, do we have many that are left from the beginning of the Celtic Church? No, but we do have some that get us back into the early period. And we'll talk a little bit more about those. And I'm telling you, we'll talk a little bit more about those because I forgot to look up and remind myself of what dates these were built. So let's just leave it with Celtic crosses right now and what's within them. But I can, whether I can tell you, I mean, this one is at, where is it at, Audrey? It's at Monster Boyce in the center of Ireland. And it sits within a cemetery that has one of these towers in it that we'll talk about when we talk about Glendalough and monastic communities. So really a center of a monastic Celtic community in old Ireland. I won't say ancient Ireland because we're still within this period of the last 2,000 years. But within it, they kept hold of these glorious crosses. And this one I'm showing you is actually one of the smaller ones here at Monster Boyce when you go into the cemetery. But within it contains a whole lot of the way Celtic Christians talked about God, talked about Holy Scripture, and in a way that was different from what was going on in the rest of Europe when they had cathedral churches built. We talked about this last week. What was used in early Europe when cathedrals and churches were built to explain to the people who may not have had the ability to read what the stories of the Bible were. What was it? Stained glass windows, that's exactly right. And that tradition is a really important tradition in Christian, Western Christianity all the way back to the beginning, because it was the best way to show images and tell stories that everybody could understand. It was like the first, I want to say comic books, but there's a better word for it now. What do we call it? Graphic novels, that's right. It was a graphic novel of the Bible. That's good, a graphic novel of the Bible, not a comic book. Well, I love comic books, but a graphic novel that explained the stories of Jesus. And they didn't build these types of, well, they did, but not quite on the same level that was happening in the rest of Europe. In Ireland, in the Celtic Church, they made use, and this gives us a good sense of why we understand Celtic Christianity and its connection with the environment, because they used what they had to create these images of their faith, and one of those important ways was through the Celtic cross. And this is a good example of that. You can see images that are carved into the cross. These are the graphic novels of the Celtic Church in early Ireland, because each one of those is a story about the gospel or about Jesus. In the next week or so, I'm going to bring you the bigger cross, which you can see in the background. See that Celtic cross there? It's a bigger one than this one. And I've got some really good up-close pictures of some of the stories within that. Now, again, how do you tell stories that people will understand in the communities they're from? You use images that they know. So you see images of the Celtic environment worked into what are really Bible stories about Jesus. And again, today we think, oh, well, they were great environmentalists thinking about their world, and they were, but they weren't thinking about the world first, they were thinking about Jesus first, and they wanted to use a story that could be translated to the local people who were coming into Christianity when it was very new. So this is one of those excellent crosses. This one is lacking one of the other things that's very important in Celtic artwork, and that is the knotwork and the designs, and I've got a picture of that coming up from the Book of Kells that I showed you last week. But each one of these parts of this Celtic cross was a way that the early Celtic Christians explained the church to the people around them. What else do we know about Celtic Christianity? That it was a very monastic-based world, but a different sort of monasticism than what will come about in the Middle Ages, the middle medieval period in Western Europe. And that is that rather than big communities of monks, there were small groups of monks who went out to live deep in the world and in the environment. And I'm going to talk about this in a minute. I'm giving everything away before I get to my checklist. So let me just tell you what this is. This is one of my shots I took this year from Skellig Michael, which I was in my sermon last week. And this was your entranceway into the monastery at the top of the island. And you can see how high up it is because you can see the little Skellig in the background. And the little Skellig is run by gannets, which are a seabird that lives in that area. And if you see some white on that, that ain't snow back there. That's not snow. It's some natural fertilizer. But there's too many birds on there for anything to ever be able to grow. But the monks skipped that island, probably for that reason, came to the bigger one of Skellig Michael, climbed up the cliff face, and built this monastery on top. And the reason why I took this photo is because it has this beautiful entrance stone. And you'll see this in a lot of early Christian communities in Ireland, this entrance place where the cross was carved into the rock. And again, rocks and stones were the main things they had to gather on that island and create with. And so they used their ability to carve into the stone to create the entrance into their communities. And this was very moving to me when I saw this cross. It almost looks like there's like a 1960s peace symbol down at the bottom. And I wonder, did somebody carve that later, or was that part of it? But I didn't ask the woman that was telling us all about it. I just know that image of the entrance stone. I had one last week from a cliff fort in County Cork that we looked at that had a carved stone into it, much later than this one. This one probably dates back to the 7th century, a very early part of the Irish tradition. And then I thought I would bring in one more shot here before we get to my checklist from the Isle of Iona in Scotland, where these Celtic crosses are also found, as well as down into Wales and Great Britain, though I think there are more in Ireland than there are left in Great Britain, but I'd have to check that. So what is it that we know about the Celtic Church? The Celtic Church was part of Roman Christianity from the beginning. This will be something that will come up in the 19th century when there's a rediscovery of Celtic Christianity and a growth in England, especially in our own Anglican tradition, to reconnect with something in our own roots that was not connected to Rome. So the idea of Celtic Christians was that they were separate from Rome, and that's just not true. The Celtic Church developed, like all European churches developed, with a lot of specific types of liturgy and ways they did worship that were different from what was going on in Rome. But they were all based in Western Christianity, which was Roman Christianity. And the proof of that is that it begins with St. Patrick in the 5th century. St. Patrick himself is a Roman Briton, if you know the story of St. Patrick. And St. Patrick in the 400s grows up with a Roman father living somewhere in England. I did go on I took my church in Jacksonville to Ireland, and we had a guy who led our tour who'd written a book and was absolutely convinced that St. Patrick was not from Great Britain. He was from Brittany in the north of France. Whether he is from there or not ultimately doesn't matter, because it isn't where he was from, but more of what he brought to Ireland. And so those of you probably know, the quick version of the story of St. Patrick is that he's a young man, and some pirates from Ireland, where Audrey comes from, is full of pirates. The O'Driscoll clan were pirates, and maybe they had something to do with going out and kidnapping Patrick in England, probably because he was from a wealthy family in Roman Brittany, or Britain, or Brittany, and they bring him across to Ireland. He lives there for 16 years, and over the time he's in Ireland, he has a major conversion to Christianity. He already has, because remember, this is past the time when Rome converts to Christianity. So in the 400s, his family would have most likely been a Christian family living in the south of England, where the Romans had a lot of power and force and were able to control that part of ancient Britain, and early Britain, I should say. And so he says that when he goes to work in Ireland, he's not very religious. But of course, if you get kidnapped and forced to be a slave in Ireland, it might get you right with God. And so Patrick says he gets right with God over those 16 years, and God tells him it's time to get out of Ireland, so he finds a way to escape and goes back to his home country. And from there, we find out that he goes to Europe and he studies, he gets ordained by a saint in Europe. He gets in trouble with some of the Christians in that area because he's not accepting gifts from people. He's refusing to be paid when he does baptisms. I mean, you think that's a modern thing. This goes all the way back to the time of Patrick. They put him up on trial. And while he's on trial, God says, you need to go back to Ireland. And maybe he says, I need to go back to Ireland. So he goes back to Ireland and brings with him the Christianity he was trained in, which is Roman Catholic Christianity, which was the only Christianity we had in the West at that time. So again, to think of the Celtic Christians as not being connected to the Roman Western, the rest of Western Europe is not correct. And, we'll talk about that more. That might not even been something playing in your mind about Celtic Christianity. But it does become something that some of my favorite Anglican priests and theologians, they'll use that argument in the 19th century in England to bring about an Anglo-Catholic movement that will cause us today to have communion every single Sunday. And it won't have its impact in America. The early American Anglican Church, Episcopal Church, would continue to do morning prayer most of the Sunday mornings with communion once a quarter, which is the way I grew up in the Baptist church doing it, if we even did it that often. But it will be this movement in the 19th century, after the American colonies have separated. It'll begin to have its influence on getting us back to our Catholic roots of Western Europe. And the way that they'll argue against the British, who still carry with them this battle with Catholicism right from the Protestant Reformation. The way that these theologians, like John Henry Newman, who eventually leave and become a Catholic himself, and all these others, is that we're just returning to what was ours in the beginning, which was the way the Celtic Church existed. And they will say, we had the rights to do this in this country before Rome came in. But they're using the beginnings of that romantic period in which they'll be creating something more than they'll really be giving us history. So it is an important understanding that Celtic Christianity really, traditionally in history, is different in the way it worships, but not different in the way it views the papal way of running the church in Western Europe at that time. What we've already talked about is it's a very monastic community. A lot of guys gathering together. I'm using the term monasticism because remember, monastery is for women and men, not just convents. That will be a later development about conventions of women religious coming together. Down in Coleman, it's a monastery where the Benedictine women nuns are. So it's monastic on all those fronts, but a very different type of monasticism, which we'll talk about. Scholastic in the way that it collects things. Everybody's already asked me several times about how the Irish saved the Western civilization. They did it because they were out of the reach of the barbarians at the time, and they were able to build monasteries. And again, what is the most important thing we talk about in the church all the time? The Word of God. What is the Word of God? It's the Scripture. So they would collect these writings. They would spend their time as monks handwriting out these gorgeous illustrated manuscripts that were related to the Bible, and they would collect all of this history about what was going on in Western Europe, and they saved the Western civilization because the barbarians didn't get to them. While they were wreaking havoc in Germany and across Western Europe and even into England when the Angles and the Saxons come into England, there's a bit of time before they're converted to Christianity. And in that time, they're not afraid to take out Christianity and replace it with the religions that were in their own families and tribes. But luckily, Ireland never got hit by them. It wouldn't be until the Vikings came, and the Vikings didn't care anything about scholastic stuff when they came in there. So luckily, that was the way it preserved. A lot of these monastic communities would lead to ascetics, that word, and being solitary, right? So that means, I've got in here islands, Culdees, and Anamkara. This idea of Anamkara, of soul friends who would go out and travel deep into the extended areas of Ireland to live out their life in close proximity to God, or to become what was known as green martyrs. Green martyrs were those, red martyrs are what you think, someone who dies for their faith. White martyrs went to places, white martyrdom was you went somewhere and you were accosted. You might not be killed, but you were completely shut down for your faith belief. The green martyrs that were a big part of Ireland, the color fits too, were those who wanted to go and seek out God in the possibility of dying in the wilderness to get closer to God. And when you see that picture I showed you of Skellig Michael, that's an image of communities that were ready to be green martyrs. They were going to go out to get closer to God, to pray to God, to do battle with the devil. I mean, this is an important part of monastic life, doing battle with evil forces for the good of the rest of the world. And they needed to get out and find the place farthest away so that they could get close to God. And if they died there, it was a green martyrdom that they accepted. The Culdees were part of that as too, and I forgot to read about them, so we'll skip over that for now. Come back to that another time. Penitential, another part of the Celtic Church, very much engaged in penance and confession, realizing that they were struggling. Another reason why they go to live out on a cliff 8 miles off the seacoast is to make amends for their own sinfulness, to alleviate sinfulness, and to gather themselves closer to God. Not an easy task, obviously, but the penitential life was important to them, and that translates into Catholicism all the way up to the present. And finally, their liturgies were different. What is liturgy? Well, that's our worship style, and the way they did their liturgies was disconnected from the way the Pope and the papal folks were doing it down in Rome, and they were using their own language as well as Latin to create these different liturgies. And next week, when we talk a little bit more about St. Patrick, we'll go over St. Patrick's breastplate, which is one of the oldest Celtic prayers we have, which speaks to the way St. Patrick understood his life as a Christian, and is very unique to the Celtic world versus the Roman world. So bits and pieces of that. Let's look at a few of these. More Celtic artwork. Both of these images are I'm going to show you, from the Book of Kells. I think I showed you one last week. But a very similar example of what was going on those Celtic crosses, right? They might not have had big cathedrals and the way to put together stained glass, but they were able to create this gorgeous artwork that in the writing or the creating, I mean, in the Eastern tradition, you don't paint an icon, you write an icon. And you write it by reciting the words of God as you're creating it. And what comes out of it is not your artistic talent, it's God's artistic talent given to you. And that carries over. There's also another thing we could talk about is the Celtic Church's connection, not just with Rome, but with the Eastern world as well. They wanted to be like the monks in the desert. They wanted to be like St. Anthony. They wouldn't have known about St. Anthony if they didn't have St. Ignatius and the Roman Church to collect that and send it up to them. But they wanted to live that life, and they create these illustrated manuscripts that look like icons from the Eastern world. And this is a good one that, of course, has what most of you probably know as the four Gospels and the symbols of the four Gospels. But within it is all that, what we think of as Celtic artwork, which is that intrinsically connected knots and bindings that show the binding together of God, the world, and humanity. That'll be the words of St. Patrick's breastplate. I bind unto myself today the strong arm of the Trinity, the binding together of God. Another reason why they went out on islands out in the middle of the sea. They wanted to remove themselves from anything that would keep them from binding themselves to God through nature, through their prayer life, through whatever the devil threw at them. That's what they were out there to do. And that comes into the artwork we see in these illustrated manuscripts. Here's another one from the Book of Kells. And again, that's the beauty. I was so disappointed when Audrey and I finally made it into Trinity College a couple of years ago to see the Book of Kells. And they have this great discussion of how they made it with all these images on the wall. All I wanted to do was to see it. And I get in there and it's only opened to like 2 pages. Maybe even only 1 page of it because they didn't write on both sides. And I was like, I want to see more. Then I had to ask myself, well, you big dummy, what do you think? They're going to cut it up and put it all in different spots? And I guess in my brain I thought that's what they would do. So I told Audrey, I was like, surely we're going to see more when we walk out of this dark room. And no, we just ended up in the library after that, which is cool in and of itself. But I mean, to be able to really see and sit and meditate, really one of the best things that's happened is the ability to get on Trinity College's website and see if you've got a really good big screen, not just your little teeny tiny iPad or your iPhone, but something this big. And even this needs more detail to really dig into it and see the beauty of it. I want to look at some pivotal moments really quickly, and then I'll take a break and take some questions of what happened in the Celtic church we know existed in the Middle Ages, in the early period of the medieval time. These are the pivotal moments. I've already mentioned one. St. Patrick, or Padraig as his Irish name would be. This is the 5th century, so the early 400s. This is when Patrick returns to Ireland and begins to spread Christianity. And he does it because he got in trouble for not asking them to pay for things, but he got in trouble in Ireland too because he wouldn't accept gifts from the kings. I mean, he was a very holy man who had one goal, and that was to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ through Ireland. And it makes him a profoundly important patron saint of that country, as we'll see going out in other places. His Christianity will be the Christianity that creates St. Columba, or Columcille. And that will be in the 6th century. St. Columba will become a Christian. He'll join a monastic community. He will upset the kings of North Ireland, and then he will decide to get on a little leather-strapped boat, the story goes, with no sails and no oars, and let God float him out into the ocean and take him where he wanted to be. Sounds crazy, but you get to know these Celtic monks, and you're like, of course they do that. And if God just burned them up and they died in the sea, they would accept it. That's what God wanted. He lands on a tiny little island in the Hebrides of Scotland, which becomes the Isle of Iona. And he builds a monastery there in 563. And he sends loads of monks now back into where Patrick came from, back into the north of England. South of England, Roman territory of Roman Britain, leaves a Christian mark from the Romans there. But in the north, it's wild country up there amongst the Picts and the other native tribes that live in Scotland and northern England. And again, where's the place the Celtic monks should go? They should go there to spread the good news. There were a few saints there before that, but they didn't do the work Columba did, because he builds a Celtic monastery on the Isle of Iona and begins to do what Patrick did, send his monks out into Scotland and the north of England to spread the good news of Jesus. One of those would be St. Aidan. There'll also be St. Cuthbert. All of these are Celtic monks that come out of Iona and move across Scotland and begin to change the landscape of religion in those worlds. Spreading, again, Christianity that came from Ireland, which makes it Celtic Christianity, which, again, does not divorce it from what's going on in the south from Rome. It's just their traditions. It's what they've been doing. It's the way they've been worshiping, and they take that with them. And we're going to talk about that here in just a few minutes, because with that comes different ways of cutting monks' hair, very important, and the way they sorted out the Feast of Easter, the big day, the Christian calendar.
Sir.
Yes?
Where is Patrick? Is he the bishop?
Patrick is
In
a...
this picture?
Oh, that's not Patrick. That's Saint Hilda of Whitby. Sorry, and I'm going to get to that. Good question. I got a picture of Patrick coming out. No, that's not. That is a woman holding everything together between what happens to become British and Irish and Celtic and Roman Christianity. And she'll be a saint that's of great importance here. I got the establishment of Lindisfarne, the death of St. Columba in 597, and the arrival of Augustine or Canterbury is the same time. So remember, Roman Britain is already Christian to a certain degree in the south, in London and all those areas of the south of England. Pope Gregory the Great sends Augustine to go up and be the first bishop to go into England and begin to create and establish what will become British Christianity. Again, those words are hard to use because at that time there was no Great Britain. There was England, and there was, I don't even know if there was an England at that time. It was an Anglo, it was a country that had the Angles and the Saxons, the Anglo-Saxons. It was becoming Anglo-land, which would become England, and it was early on. And so the Pope sends him off to this wild country to establish the church there. He sets it up in Canterbury in the south of England and begins this movement of reestablishing a very Roman Christianity following. He knew the rules because the Pope just sent him there. He knew what they were supposed to do. And he runs into Christians in the north. And this is what will come to be the Synod of Whitby, which Hilda of Whitby will put together. She's an abbot of a monastery, a female abbot of a monastery. She was like a bishop in controlling all of the communities that she oversaw. She brings these two groups together and makes a decision on what will change in Celtic Christianity. Not that anything really changes in Celtic Christianity, except a few decisions that are made in this synod to get it in line with what's going on in the rest of Europe. And then, of course, I've already mentioned the rediscovery of the Celtic Church in the 19th century. Here's a couple of stained glass windows that I came across just this year. This one is in St. Mary's Cathedral in Killarney. Gorgeous cathedral in Killarney. Not an old cathedral because most of the old churches in Ireland are run by the Church of England. Or the Church of Ireland, which is connected with the Church of England. The Catholic churches had to rebuild, and they rebuilt a gorgeous big stone cathedral in Killarney. And they have all these Celtic saints. And I love this picture because it includes another saint we'll talk about, St. Bridget. And if you look at St. Bridget's halo, if you can see it, it contains Celtic knots within it. And St. Bridget, who will be really one of the Celtic saints that crosses the line of the Druids and the Christians, because more than likely there was a Bridget or a bride who might have been a pagan goddess. And so Bridget herself may have been named after her, but becomes a Christian saint. And this wonderful image I love is St. Bridget bringing the winding sheet for the dead body of Patrick. And this is the confusion about when did Bridget exist? Was she at the time of Patrick, or was she at the time of St. Columba? All of these things are part of the mystery of St. Bridget, to which our daughters, the King, carry the name and the title. And if you want to see a beautiful St. Bridget's cross, just go in the parlor, and there's one in there. And of course, this is an image of St. Columcille or St. Columba. This comes from the Abbey in Iona as well, and I have it hanging on my door, I told you all last week. And this is the full image of it, of St. Columba, who becomes an extremely important saint, coming into bringing the faith from Ireland into the north of England and really giving us this idea of Celtic Christianity. I had this map last week, and I'll just show it again to show you this movement. If you can think about earlier than that arrow pointing up from Ireland and going through Iona and coming down into the north of England to St. Patrick 100 years earlier, coming across from somewhere in that Welsh area of England and bringing the faith into County Wicklow is where they think St. Patrick landed. There's also a chapel built in Slane up in Northern Ireland. One of those areas is where Patrick brought it in, spread it through Ireland, and then that arrow is the movement of Columba, down all the way pointing to Whitby, if you can see up there. Don't read the German, because I'm not good at German. But, and you see Canterbury in the south. That's that coming together of Celtic Christianity and Roman Christianity. Again, in the 19th century, they'll paint the picture of that moment like a spiritual warfare going on. The Celts were going to get their way, and the Romans forced them to do it. That's all Rome ever does, is force us to do what they want us to do. I would say that's a 19th century image of what really happened, where St. Hilda calling them together and saying, look guys, you got to stop shaving your head different ways. It's just really distracting. And we've got to figure out when Easter is, because you're messing everybody up by you guys celebrating on this day and you guys just down the street celebrating on another day. This is what's left of Whitby in the north of Ireland near York. Not north of England, sorry, near York, York Minster. A beautiful place. This plays well into Bram Stoker's Dracula. He'll see this image and he'll paint a picture. I just got into Gothic horror. Excuse me, I'll get back to Christianity, but it looks scary when you look at it that way. And then an image of tonsures. I want to wrap this up by giving you an idea about cutting monks' hair and why it was so important. This is an image of the bishop, or more than likely, this is the abbot of the monastery, cutting the hair of the monk. This was a sacrifice given. We still see nuns, even though not all of Roman Catholic nuns even more, wear habits, but the habits were there as a sacrificial giving away. You were married to Christ forever. The same way with the monastic tonsure, cutting your hair off and opening up God to your head, in some strange way. Also a symbol of marriage to God in a different way than the habit is for nuns. But it was very important, and this image here is an image of what the monastic tonsure will look like in Western Europe, again in the Middle Ages. All the way up, there's images of Thomas Merton when the monks, the Cistercian monks in the early 20th century were still making tonsures on their heads, and they look like that. This is a fun image. I have no idea if this is real or not, because they didn't have iPhones in 662, so nobody ever took a picture of what a tonsure looked like in the Celtic church. But I found this, no idea who made it, but it looked cool, so I thought I'd show it to you. The possible difference between the Roman tonsure and the Celtic tonsure. I would go with the Roman tonsure myself. It looks a little more halo-like than that odd little shaving of the middle of the head it looks very Celtic because he's got longer hair, right? He could be cool Celtic wearing his long hair with a little shaved part in the middle. The truth is, we don't know what the difference was. We just knew there was an argument about it. This is the argument compared with how they celebrate Easter, and that involves Julian calendars and Gregorian calendars, and I ain't even going to try to explain it because I don't understand it myself. But they used a different calendar in the Celtic world because they hadn't caught up with the changes that were made in Rome for the Gregorian calendar, and so they were figuring out Easter in a different way. I would like to tell you that way back in 662, they still based it on the first full moon after the spring equinox, all that stuff. That sounds very pagan, doesn't it? But that's really based on the Passover, the Jewish tradition. But I don't know how they did it back then. The calendars were different, but they were celebrating Easter on different days. And it was very important that somebody come in and stop this foolishness, and that is St. Hilda of Whitby, a great saint. Yeah, I'm not going to say it, y'all know. I had to come in and, you guys are ridiculous, settle down, and let's sort this out. And that's dear old St. Hilda. We're running out of time. I can't remember what else happened, but we talked more. That really is about the best explanation we have of the Celtic Church. Their monastic traditions, their attempt to be exiles in the wilderness, their use of what they had, which really didn't make them any more different than anybody else. Just in Ireland, you had stones and you had ways of carving those, and that's what they used. The language that they used, Latin versus the Celtic, or what we now call Gaelic languages, all of these things were part of the Western tradition. It was just the tradition that happened in Ireland and Scotland until 662. And I'm going to show you, I say questions here, but I don't know if we got much time. It's just really cool to watch the questions. Before you raise your hands, we'll talk more about this image, which to me is a great image of Celtic Christianity and their attempt to be exiles with God. and to be in the nature of what they had to sustain themselves on, and to do it in order to get themselves closer to God. I would say Christian mystics have been doing that in all traditions, but in Ireland you had certain ways of doing it. And this will probably be one of my favorite photos of all time, because I actually made it up all those steps and I was proud of myself. And I wanted everybody to see how steep they were before I went down. But we'll talk more about that next week, because I don't want to just talk about history, I want to talk about personal encounters with Celtic Christianity. We'll talk about a few saints next week, and I'll share a few of my encounters, and maybe you've got some encounters with Celtic Christianity, whether it's you decided to get your head shaved a certain way and you thought you were being a Celt versus a Roman, or whether it involved thin places, which has become a tradition in more modern Celtic Christianity about getting closer to God. I tell you what, there are lots of places in Ireland I've been that are thin places, this one being one of them. And whether or not the ancient Celts thought that way or not, they were seeking that thin place to be close to God. And that's what we'll talk about next week. Any quick questions? Because as usual, I started late and ran over late. Barbara's had her hand up there for.
I have a quick story.
Okay.
I took my mother to Ireland because she's first generation American and always wanted to go there. Strong Irish Roman Catholic.
Yeah.
We visited St. Patrick's grave.
Yeah.
St. Patrick's grave is at an Anglican church in Ireland, and my mother about had a heart attack.
Yeah. Well, your mother should have known the English weren't really happy about letting the Catholics keep those old churches. So more than likely every old church you go to in Ireland that the Church of Ireland runs was the Catholic Church at one time. So that leads to that experience of where Patrick is buried. I mean, but that's the wonderful myth of St. Patrick, and it's not a myth. He's buried somewhere, but there are probably 4 or 5 spots where Patrick is buried. And you just found a really good one in a beautiful church. Jack.
The previous image.
Yeah. Sorry. There we go.
Is that Hadrian's Wall?
Yeah, that's Hadrian's Wall there, which of course the Romans built to separate themselves. There's a story that Patrick grew up somewhere near Hadrian's Wall. But again, there's another story that he grew up somewhere down more in the more Roman controlled and not the Roman attack area of Hadrian's Wall. But yeah, that image gives you a sense of the different areas and where that location of Hadrian's Wall is, which is the separation. And again, that's the amazing part, is because the Irish Christians see Iona all the way up there in the top. That's where St. Columba goes, and he sort of makes a sneak attack. Rather than being the Romans charging through the wall, he comes through the inside. He sneaks over the wall and comes through into Scotland that way and brings his Christianity down and over Hadrian's Wall and into England from that direction, which is pretty impressive. So the battle of Christianity won't happen at Hadrian's Wall, but it's pretty darn, I just pulled that off. It's pretty darn close, because Lindisfarne is above Hadrian's Wall. Belinda, where's York? I should have had that picture on here. It's south of the wall. Okay, so south of Whitby. So that is where, there's Whitby, thank you, and there's York, yeah. So Whitby's where the Christians meet to have their discussion. So Romans and Celtic Christians get past Hadrian's Wall, and it's Whitby where they have their discussion that leads to the changes. Yeah. I should have brought my laser pointer, sorry. It's over in the Northumbrian part of England. Any other? Yes, Brian. They can't start church without me, so I'm preaching today. I'm preaching, so. Oh, Patrick and snakes. You know, the image of Patrick and snakes, I'll talk a little bit about that too, because there's a story in County Kerry that Patrick runs the snakes all the way down to Skellig Michael. And in that part of Kerry, the snakes begin to win the battle with Patrick, and St. Michael comes on Skellig Michael, that's why it's named after him, and intercedes, as good old Archangel Michael's supposed to do, to save us from the devil. But that's really the image. It's physical snakes, because there aren't any snakes in Ireland. But the image of Patrick running them out is really a symbol of running the devil out of Ireland, which would have been ascribed to the pagan communities and religious beliefs there. So he runs the snakes out, and that's what snakes are always an image of, which from the story of Adam and Eve, in which it's just called a serpent, That symbol is a symbol of the devil. So, did he really run the snakes out? It's just too cold up there for him, right? So, there aren't any snakes up there. Yeah. But he did run the devil out, no question about that. Yes, Richard?
Given those others who come from the Scottish background.
Yeah.
Was there in that time period any significant difference from what was going on in the Scottish side as compared to the other areas?
Yeah, well, the Scotland's the unbroken territory by the Romans, so it's only when Columba comes in that Christianity begins to spread there, and that's 100 years after Patrick's been in Ireland. So Patrick plants it amongst the Celts in Ireland, and then sends it out and up into Scotland, and really, not only does the Irish save Western civilization, it saves Christianity, and that is what brings Christianity to those final places on the edge of the Western world at the time. And it brings it back and meets up with what the Romans had done in the south of England right about the time of 662. All right, folks, I hate to say it, but they may not be able to start without me, but they may be. I'll see you next week. Thank you.